It's 1993 and the BBC are marking Doctor Who's 30th anniversary with a massive documentary. A documentary that to this day I still think is excellent. There are moments in that documentary that I remember just as vividly as I do anything else from the TV show. For example, the child entering the TARDIS. That's probably the best entrance into the TARDIS that there's ever been. Now, by this point, I'd had 4 years to catch up with some of the show since it got taken off the air just as I was falling in love with it. So by this point, I was fully immersed and I was never ever to leave the sometimes murky pool of being a Doctor Who fan. Now, that said, even though I'd had 4 years, there were still some stories that I just hadn't seen. Quite a lot of them, in fact. And so 30 years in the TARDIS offered valuable glimpses into unseen Doctor Who for me. So why am I banging on about the 30th anniversary documentary when this is a video about Terror of the Zygons? Well, one of those clips of Unseen Who came along and sort of like convinced me of something that turned out to be heartbreakingly false. Hello, welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through Doctor Who from the very beginning, and you join me as we hit the beginning of season 13. A clip of Patrick Troughton from The Seeds of Death.
I'm a genius.
As a 9-year-old, I was convinced that they were Zygons, that there was another story that featured them, and with my favourite Doctor, no less. I couldn't wait to see that one day. As I grew older and more au fait with the show's history, I was still really surprised to discover that the Zygons had been only one-off adversaries, and that's something that I continued to think was odd right up until their return in 2013. Now, when their return was announced, I wasn't so much excited as mumbling, yeah, of course, obviously that makes sense. What's taken them so long? Besides them being utterly striking as an alien design, especially for a child and one that stayed with me for years afterwards, they were spoken about in quite exalted terms. Certainly for a monster that appeared in only one story. Proportionately, they'd be on a par with the Daleks and the Cybermen and the Sontarans and the Ice Warriors. And they still did seem to have this sort of like reputation of being one of the big five. And that's even taking into account the Silurians, who had the honour of actually returning. And that, I think, is the legacy of the Zygons. Now, I know that they've come back in the new show since, but they seem to have this sort of like reputation for being such an enduring creation on the basis of having only met them once. Got to therefore be one of the most successful Doctor Who creations, surely. And I think that is still the case. They are so good. When a show is over 10 years old, it can be difficult to hit upon something new in terms of design. The Silurians are an intriguing idea, but conform slightly to that science fiction idea of green men. The Zygons, on the other hand, feel fresh. They look amazing and they sound amazing, and they highlight just how rare it actually is in Doctor Who for aliens to feel truly alien. The bitchy customs officials from Carnival of Monsters, though delightful, are just men painted blue. The Cybermen are metal creatures, increasingly indistinguishable from common or garden robots. The Zygons register immediately as otherworldly, only enhanced by their organic technology, which, is something that really rings the changes. Intelligent alien species with the capability to invade are often depicted with sort of like shiny, gleaming metal ships. The Axons had something different from that, but with the Zygons, we're presented with a distinct technology that is vastly different from anything we've seen on the show before. They succeed on every level and are pretty much everything you would want from a Doctor Who monster. One which is unsettling, a little disgusting, and the ones that we meet are thoroughly rotten eggs. The head scratching as to why it took so long for them to come back occurs every single time I watch this story, and this one was no exception. They are just excellent. They're the best alien we've had in ages. And yet, subsequent revisits of this story after that initial first viewing was left further and further in the past, I found myself growing less and less fond of it. I never recalibrated my view of the Zygons themselves, just that the story that they were in, it seemed a little bit too cumbersome and like it didn't really live up to them. And that's something I felt quite guilty of, I guess, considering its reputation as one of Doctor Who's better installments. Now, I've never got to the point where I've thought of it as any less than alright, but I have got to the point where I've sort of watched it and I've sort of like been willing it to be as good as I found it on that first viewing, and it never ever was. But the thing is, as it comes around on this marathon, it has gone some way to recapturing that first feeling. Having loved it as a child and then spending my 20s and 30s drifting further and further away from it, I did have the experience this time of sort of like experiencing it anew. So, does it live up to the Zygons themselves yet? Well, I can't in all good faith say that it quite does. But does it fully recapture that awesomeness of first watching it 30 years ago? I can't in all good faith say that it quite does that either. But what it does do is actually become far more clearer as the thoroughly decent story that it is. And I'll take that as a result. I mean, like, it used to have me a little bit upset that I guess, fell out with Terror of the Zygons. And now I consider this viewing as a sort of reconciliation. No, it still isn't quite as fantastic as it was when I first watched it as a child. But it's getting closer. This is the closest it's been since that first viewing. From this point on, you'll be hard-pressed to find me using any superlatives to describe it, because I still can't really put my foot in the camp of it being an absolute classic. It still falls a little bit short of that, but it is without doubt a solid slice of Doctor Who. Now that said, there is something a little bit strange about revisiting the Brigadier and Benton, in that it felt like we'd left them behind. Not that I'm displeased to see them, of course, far from it, they're Benton and the Brig, but they bring with them a foggy sort of quality. Not enough time has passed for this to be either a grand reunion or for me to have missed them very much. And conversely, too much time and space has passed for them to feel like a part of the fabric of the show at the moment, and that's what generates that fog, I think. Now, my biggest reservation with the Baker years so far is that I haven't actually felt like their own beast. I've said that several times in previous videos. And so, when I started to detect that it was playing its own furrow, the latter half of season 12, I sat up and I took notice. So to bring back such overt hangovers from the previous era, just as it feels like this one is getting off the ground to be its own thing, it doesn't feel like the right thing to do. Now, this might become the latest in a long line of unpopular opinions on this channel, but basically I find myself simultaneously pleased to see them at the same time as a little bit wishing they weren't there. That isn't to say they aren't fun. Courtney and Levine are lovely to watch and perhaps even invigorated by a short spell away. And the characters of the Brig and Benton do always bring something to the plate. It's the decision to include them which I question, not the performances or the characters themselves. But haven't you answered your own question there, Chris, when you say that they always bring something to the plate? Well, I've answered why I think they're good characters, and while they do offer to Terror of the Zygons what they offer to any other story that they're in, they do still feel by definition like ties to a bygone era, when it does feel like the show at this point should be severing those. I like the Brigadier and I like Benton, but here they're just whopping great reminders of the fact that the Baker years isn't really doing all that much to feel like its own thing. A return a couple of years down the line would be absolutely fantastic, and indeed it is in the Brigadier's case. But it just feels like a distinctly odd time to have them. Like it's like I said, it's not a long enough time for it to be a reunion, and so therefore it kind of feels like they're just hanging around. And I just can't shake that. I get that you could argue that it's the show in transition and it's gradually phasing out these elements from the past, but I mean, a full season's happened now, and by the very nature of Doctor Who, where serial follows serial, it doesn't actually end up feeling gradual. It feels stop-start. Regardless, the story itself gets off to a cracking start with the destruction of the oil rigs. And there again, I find myself detecting some very real echoes of the Troughton era. I concede that might be unfair, and the presence of a rig really only reminds me of Fury from the Deep, but I'm already getting the feeling of this time in the show being like a Frankenstein's monster of Doctor Who, that perhaps I'm primed to just further detect these echoes, I don't know. Either way, it's a mere nod of recognition which just about registers in a very well executed opening salvo. And the whole thing is directed very well. I mean, of course it is, it's a Camfield. And even latter elements that could be seen to be unfortunate are done as well as they could be. Yes, okay, it is a pity about the Scarrison not being stellar to look at, but I find myself oddly okay with it. And maybe that feels a little bit hypocritical after I said that the dinosaurs were a very big stumbling block in Invasion. So Invasion of the Dinosaurs, I ended up giving 4 out of 5 because it's a fantastic story. But I honestly do think I would have given it a full 5 if it weren't for the dinosaurs. Now, you know, I know it's a silly thing to get hung up on, but they are so overt in the story, and so much is made of them, and they are used so prominently, that because the production team bit off more than they could chew, yes, it is a bit of a ding against the story, unfortunately. But here I think there's a very real difference. Apparently Letts felt confident enough to attempt dinosaurs based on what they'd achieved with the Drashigs in the previous season, but the thing about Drashigs is they're a made up creature and they'll look how we're told they look. But with the dinosaurs, you know, we've got an idea of what they should look like, and we know that they wouldn't have moved like the toys in Invasion of the Dinosaurs did, so there's already a stumbling block there. And it's the same with the Scarison, really, to be honest. It's a thing that's native to the Zygons' home planet. Therefore, you know, it looks how we're told it looks. It looks a bit shoddy. Fine, okay, that's how a Scarison looks. So it doesn't quite fail in the same way as I think the dinosaurs did. That had the unfortunate effect of too often yanking me out of an excellent story, whereas here, the Scarison is merely a less successful part of the story without removing me from it. Besides which, Camfield actually makes a pretty decent stab of the Doctor being pursued by it, and, if you squint, the climax in London doesn't quite plumb the depths of the dinosaurs' cuddle fight. And that it's directed as well as it can be, that helps a bunch as well. So with the Scarison not really having dented my appreciation of the story, and the Scarison could be argued to be this story's biggest, obstacle, I actually am quite delighted in finding myself on my way to being reconciled with Terror of the Zygons. I'm quite taken with the script of this one, which continues the real strength the last story film, Genesis of the Daleks, showed on the page, and it just rockets along, which is no doubt helped by the fact that it's 4 episodes rather than 6. Although I have mentioned before how 4 episodes of Doctor Who is not an automatic guarantee of a really pacey story. Even with 4 episodes, sometimes Doctor Who manages to make a hash of things, so it shouldn't be taken as granted that a 4-parter is going to be some breezy affair. Revenge of the Cybermen, for example. And there is some good intrigue added to the plot, but we're also given some room for the Doctor to be, fussing about teeth and throwing out some batshit hypotheses. I think what I'm saying is that the whole thing is very Doctor Who, perhaps almost quintessentially so. And yet, while I've referenced that I still get the feeling of this era not quite having found its voice yet, what with being Troughton-y with the oil rigs and Pertwee with the unit flavour, somehow it manages to finish up all Tom Baker. He really is effortless now. He feels in command of the ship and is beginning to let himself relax a little bit. Now this rubs off on the whole dynamic. Sarah and Harry have consistently been played very capably by the adept Elizabeth Sladen and Ian Marter, and here, in their last story as a regular trio, is where they feel most comfortable with each other. Their walking into view while all sharing the Doctor's clothes is a gloriously understated touch. With no words, just the image of Harry and Sarah in his scarf and hat galvanises them in a way far more starkly than scenes and scenes of dialogue ever could. Among all the daring do where Tom Baker can play the hero, he is also offering some very left field acting choices which further distance him from the 3 men that played the part before him, and the further he gets away from the 3 other Doctors, the more I'm impressed by him. If you twisted my arm, I'd say he's probably the closest to Hartnell in terms of natural eccentricity, which feels like exactly the right choice after 2 Doctors that went very different ways. And even though he is maybe walking the same path as some of them, he's definitely doing it in his own gait. I always think of that strange scene where the Doctor hypnotises Sarah, then wails aloud. It is so odd, and Baker performs it so sincerely as to almost border on menacing. Troughton sided against monsters to become an unlikely hero, and Pertwee played the Doctor so straight you could almost mistake him for human if it weren't for the name dropping of Nelson and the like. So this is a very unsubtle reminder that the Doctor is an alien and isn't like us. We haven't had anybody to remind us of that quite so successfully since Hartnell left the show. And it's another tick next to Baker's name as he forges forward and carves his own niche into the programme. Then we bid, for the time being, farewell to someone who has, without question, surprised me in just how magnificent he's been. Not only has Ian Marter been a treasured presence on the show as Harry, he gets the chance here to play another character completely. He is just as great as Zygon Harry, and the scene in the barn with the pitchfork is another indicator that the show is slowly breaking out of its chrysalis and the Baker era is slowly becoming that key thing, its own thing. Sarah pursuing Zygon Harry and being menaced with a pitchfork is like something out of a Hammer horror film. And sure, we've had glimpses before, but I don't think we've had quite so overt an example of Doctor Who thinking of itself as a horror rather than just utilising its tools occasionally. So yeah, I consider Terror of the Zygons somewhat rehabilitated in my estimations. Now, the last 3 stories that I could say I have unequivocally truly enjoyed have been Genesis of the Daleks, The Time Warrior and The Green Death. So in a way, that's going back quite a bit. So it is with relief that Terror of the Zygons, while again I didn't enjoy it quite as much as those 3 stories, there are still caveats, but the fact that I enjoyed it this much, considering my relationship with it over the last 30 years, it's great. 405 episodes down, the seal broken on Tom's 2nd year, a goodbye to Harry as our regular, and the feeling that once again the show is that little step closer into being its own thing in the Tom Baker years. So, you know, a lot to be excited about, even if I might have a little bit of trepidation with the next story. But then I had trepidation about this one, and look how it's turned out. The pitchfork scene, it feels like a new kind of Doctor Who. I mean, it is still the Scarrison, but that doesn't mean I think it's totally irredeemable. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this layover in Loch Ness, then you know how YouTube works. Please do give it a like and spread the word. It'd be great to get as many Doctor Who fans running the marathon alongside us. And what do you think of this one? Are the Zygons one of Doctor Who's greatest ever creations, or should they have remained just a one-off? Is it a shame to lose Harry as a regular so soon, or was he not bringing anything to the table for you? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for a tangle with the Anti-Man. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, clang the cloister bell, and I'll see you on Zeta Minor.